Destiny Spurrell, Dr. Destiny Spurrell is gracing us with her presence today. Thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast, Destiny.
My pleasure, Cindy. I love the work that you are doing, and I'm happy to be here to be a part of it.
Yes. So the listeners do know I've mentioned you several times on the podcast. So if people have listened to most of the episodes, whenever I reference the woman who gave me the best advice for birth, which was the more you can get out of your way, the better.
Mm.
Even
Mm.
though even though I had my pen and pencil handy, ready for all the tips and tricks and techniques and supplements and everything, that is what you said to me. And I was like, okay, I need to pay attention to this. So
I
you
still feel that. So this is how many years later, I still feel that so deeply in my bones.
it's simple and it resonated. And I was like, okay, all right, this
Mm.
is the advice. This is it, And obviously, I did my preparation and all of that stuff, but you've really opened up my eyes to the fact that there's just other possibility when it
Mm.
comes to how we welcome our children into this world. Because before seeing how you navigated your journey, it was very simple to me. It was just you go to the hospital, you get an epidural, the end, period.
Mm.
And just by being your friend and we were in school together and you happened to get pregnant at that time and watching you navigate. And I was like, oh, wait a second. Oh, hello. You can do this in another way. What's a midwife? What?
Self-prescribed?
Yeah.
Pre-decided? Okay.
So thank you for that. Just having that impact on me in my life. And for the listeners, I'd love for them just to get to know a little bit of your background because I think it's important for why you had such a big impact on me.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Cindy. I feel very strongly that things don't come from me, but through me. And so it's just really, I love when something that has come through me or an experience that I have has been able to reach somebody else. So thank you for sharing that. We all have sort of a unique backstory and what plays into our perspective and our experience, right? And I think understanding a little bit of my backstory might give context to anything that I have to say. And it might make you feel like, oh, yeah, I want to listen to what she has to say. And it might make you feel like, I don't want this woman's opinion on things. And that's perfect. So the goal really is to help you understand where the perspective is coming from so that you can take it into your own context. So, firstly, I think I would start by saying I come from a long line of women who had a lot of births, so big families. And I'll just speak directly to what I heard from my mom and her circle. There was not fear in the stories that I heard. I watched my mom be pregnant with two pregnancies after me, and I watched her go off to the hospital when she was in labor, and there was never any fear. There was never any complaining about how it went. There were funny stories about eating horseradish beforehand, but like never fear, angst, or like stress after. And I think that imprints early. So that's one piece. I worked as a respiratory therapist, like Cindy said. In respiratory therapy, of course, you show up anywhere that there's a crisis of the airway, which part of my training was in the NICU and attending high risk births. And then, yes, just mostly those two pieces is what I would say I would highlight. And so I think I definitely got an appreciation for how fast you need to respond in certain contexts in birth and how quickly things can change for the good or for the bad in the course of a baby's health. So that's part of my perspective. And I married an anesthesiologist. So many of you know anesthesia in the context of surgery. Anesthesia is who does the epidurals or the general for a C-section or a spinal, depending on what your story is. And so my husband, by the time we were pregnant, had been at many, many births. And people often comment, you're a naturopathic doctor, he's a medical doctor. Like, how does that work? And I think the unique thing about the way that he thinks is that he does not he scrutinizes information sort of the same across the board. So whether it's coming from a medical doctor or a naturopathic doctor, he's taking the same level of criticism. They all have a little bit of bias, but he's taking sort of the same level of judiciousness in evaluating the information as just the facts that they are. And he's very good at patterns. So this leads to that, leads to that. It's his job to predict potential crises in anesthesia. I'd heard a lot of stories and he had a lot of perspective there as well. And then I would say, of course, we had the perspective of going through, Cindy and I went through the naturopathic college, the training together. So we had that perspective. I think my own health journey and entering into the practice of yoga gave me a lot of insight into, how mind impacts body and my relationship to myself and my body and just the interplay of those facets. Now, is there anything else I would say into that? I think those are really kind of the key pieces that factored into what I considered when I was thinking about birth and what I was comfortable with and all of that.
It was so interesting to me because I was like, okay, like here's a couple. They've both worked in the hospital. They're both doctors. Like they're both very intelligent. Like you're one of the most competent women that I know.
Well, thank you.
And so it gave me pause. It wasn't like, even though this is very valid and right now I see it very differently, but it wasn't the stereotype of this like, free spirit. I just want to like free birth. And I feel like if I saw that, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. But just seeing how you navigated it and your background and your knowledge and your education, it really just gave me pause to think like, oh, there's something here that I need to pay attention to. And it was even before I was thinking about starting a family myself. And so it planted the seed very early. And that's what happens, I think, when people follow what they feel is right for them. It
Mm,
plants seeds for other people around them without like, you never were like, Cindy, you should do this when you start your family. It was never like that. It was just very much like, I witnessed you, I observed how you navigated things,
mm,
and that's kind of like what you said, it imprinted something onto me. I'm always really curious about like the decision making, like what you were
right.
saying about how you and Dave come to different decision making and how you look at the evidence or look at the information and scrutinize it and see what's right for you in your life. And so I'd love for you to give me, I've heard some of it before from you, but give me
Yeah.
and the listeners some of the reasoning behind why you chose different paths for your birth.
Yeah. I'll share one more piece of background there. I had the most excruciating menstrual cramps prior to getting pregnant. And this will link back to birth. But what I'll often say to people, and this is not an exaggeration, is that I would rather do my labors 3 days in a row than to have the menstrual cramps that I would have 3 days in a row. Now, of
Wow.
course, that's going to be put into the context of what my labors were actually like, but I hope at least it sheds some light on the intensity of that, what that was like for me before having kids. And I speak to that because there wasn't much that helped with those menstrual cramps, but what I would go to often was water, warm water. And something like counter pressure on the abdomen or on the low back. So I sort of knew those things about myself already. So, but yeah, we were pregnant. I had watched my older sister have a midwife. I didn't have sort of any reasons not to have a midwife in terms of complications or considerations in my pregnancy. I contacted a midwife practice, and I in my head was thinking, yeah, we'll do the midwife thing. That'll be nice to have her with me. And then we'll go to the hospital, we'll do our birth, fine and dandy. We're close to a really nice large center, very well known for its competence and all, in delivering babies, etc., and the experience. And that'll be that. That's what we'll do. A little bit kind of like you were saying, Cindy, that it's like the path seemed like just the obvious thing that I would do. And I think it was my husband that asked me questions, I think based on what he had seen as well. Like, do you want to be in the hospital? Do you not want to be in the hospital? Do you want to labor at home as long as you're comfortable laboring at home and just prepare for either way? What do you want to do? He also was the one that was like, I've seen you with your menstrual cramps. Do you want to labor in water? And he felt most comfortable not laboring in water at the hospital, but rather having a birth pool style thing. So he started asking me questions that made me ask myself questions. And right, wrong, or other. So we went to an info session on home birth, and I asked a lot of my questions. And I was really afraid of some of I shouldn't say afraid. I guess that's the word that came out. So that's probably how I felt. I was really aware of the things that can happen fast in a birth. And I wanted to know, in the context of a home birth, how do we manage this? I need to understand so that I can lean in how these variables would be managed. And for me, right, wrong, or other, this may or may not be the big things to consider for everybody, but for me, it was like, what if I hemorrhage? What if there's shoulder dystocia? What if there's meconium? What if there's retained placenta? What if all of these and more, right?
Yeah, lots to consider, especially when you've seen things happen in the hospital setting.
Right. And so there was a couple considerations that became really important to me. It was, if we need to go to, if we're at home. So I needed answers to those questions for myself to feel comfortable doing what felt right to me. And I don't know that I even really had a fixed idea. I just knew that what I wanted to do, where I landed for me, is I wanted to labor so long as it was comfortable. That seems like a funny word, but so long as it felt aligned to me to labor at home, I would labor at home. And if I needed to transfer, then I would transfer. And what would that look like based on my phase of labor? And what would that look like if there were complications that arose? I had in my head that it would be like, I'd show up in the emergency, then I'd be triaged, then I'd be whatever, right? Which is not how I came to understand how it would go if I needed to transfer in an emergent circumstance. So I asked a lot of questions, both from my husband to understand why he was asking questions, like what perspective led him to ask the questions that he was asking me, and also of my midwives at the time, who I did feel were quite good at giving me insight from their clinical experience and research papers. That was, I think, largely how I sort of settled on how do I want to navigate. And I think, right, wrong, or other, for me in that circumstance, I didn't really have a way I needed it to be or go. I kind of knew how I wanted to relate to the process, given my understanding. Like what I shared, I wanted to labor at home as long as I felt aligned in doing so. I needed to understand what it would look like if I was going to transfer. What would it look like if I did deliver at home? And theoretically, because you can't know all of these things. And so for birth number one, that's what I decided to do. I decided to have a birth pool at home, labor there as long as I felt comfortable, and then transfer if and when it was warranted based on the advice of my team, essentially, who I felt quite comfortable with at that time. I think I have to do a plug for doulas. Yeah. Based on my experience. And I think, I don't know exactly what led me into, I think there was a lot of our classmates that had gone to do doula certifications. And I think because I didn't have a lot of like family or supports around, and I knew how I responded to having just that support, like how much having that support would allow me to turn off the stress response of my own nervous system. And so I think if this is digging back over 13 years now, but that also led me to look into what does doula support look like? Because I didn't really have a ton of I had great friends. Like Cindy helped me study with a baby in my arms. Like I had great friends, but in terms of like all of those practical pieces of like who to call when something went sideways, or like who's watching my 6-week old when I'm writing an exam, don't do that. And all of those pieces led me to seek out doula support as well, which is not what your midwife is there for. They are taking care of you medically, and if and when they have the bandwidth, they will support you if that is in their skill set. A doula is really there to support you emotionally, to get you that washcloth, to give you that counter pressure, to encourage you when you feel like you can't do it anymore, to just stand beside you, hear you, and just be there with you. And can your partner do that? Yeah, absolutely, in their own way, but they are having their own experience too, and it's so valid. It's so their experience is big in its own way. Um, and that's, I don't know how many interviews you've done with partners, birthing partners, but
Just
it's
two.
such an intriguing, uh, it's so intriguing to me to hear the experience of the birth partner as well. But yeah, so that was another piece for me that I knew from myself that having a doula or a labor support person would allow me to lean in to myself in a different way, or to let go in a different way that for some reason I felt was necessary for me, not helpful for me. Yeah.
It's an important distinction for people to hear. Your midwife is there to make sure things are happening smoothly and safely. And if something happens, then they need to really focus on that. And some midwives are great at doing the emotional support, but the doula, that's what they're there for.
Right. And I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but in one of my, so I've had three children. I didn't share that part. I had three children. And in one of the births, we needed to respond relatively quickly to the medical circumstance. And that took the attention of both my midwife and my partner. They were both in that experience. And had I not had a doula with me in that experience, I would have been sitting by myself, alone, with no one, not knowing what was happening, having just delivered my baby with not a single soul around me if I didn't have that doula there. Now, this was at home, so maybe in the hospital there'd be another nurse that would have been there. Maybe not, I don't know. But the amount of containment in that circumstance when I look back was, it dramatically changed what that experience could have been for me. That for me was just such a supportive piece in my experience, is having someone that was there and looking out for me in that way.
I feel the same. The more I learn, I'm like, everyone who wants a doula should have a doula. It's because the partner, like you said, sure, they can do that, but they're also having their own experience. That's not their job. So they've probably only seen like one or two, maybe this is the first birth that they're experiencing as well. And so to be able to support you during that is sometimes asking a lot.
I
It's
hear,
important.
yeah, and what I hear often from that birth partner is they're watching you, and it's a lot for them to see your experience, right? And someone who's going to be there to support you, it's going to feel really containing if they're unfazed by your experience. And if it's new, it is a really primal experience, right? And not one that we see often, where we don't see the, this is not a word probably, but primality of our humanity to that level on the day to day.
I totally agree. And so it is asking a lot of a partner to like, remain centered and be able to provide that stability for you in that moment without someone else to kind of offer that. I remember when you were going through your decision making process for your first,
Yeah.
and we were in school, and so I was so curious and I was asking you a bunch of questions, and you brought up the hospital environment itself and the exposure to different
Mm,
bacteria and that kind of stuff. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that, because that again gave me a lot of pause, and I was like, oh yeah, because I was learning about the microbiome, and
right,
it was like, I think we were in school like 15 years ago at this point. So it was like the new science that was
right.
coming out about the microbiome, and we were getting all excited about it.
And again, I think this actually came from more of like my husband's insight working in that context and then asking questions of the midwives and such. I think it's really important to keep context when we're having this kind of conversation because the in light of an emergent situation, this conversation means nothing, right? I remember having that conversation of how to foster a healthy flora for your infant. And some of the things we learned in school was, if you yourself have a good flora and then your baby is birthed through the vaginal canal where they get exposure to that flora on their skin, even up their nose a little, and into, across them, they're bathed in it essentially as they go through that birth canal. Then if they can get skin to skin and if they are breastfeeding, like then they are getting, if you have a good flora, then those are sort of some of the big ways that you can pass on that good flora and the immunity and all of those other variables that can impact them. The In a hospital setting, there's just more bugs, period. And so it's added into the mix of things. And yes, we do like the clean technique and the sterile this and the yada yada. There's just the potential for more exposure that can impact the flora of baby. Now, what does that actually mean tangibly? This is not the point I would stress about when I'm making a decision about birth. But it was kind of like if we can labor at home and have less exposure and feel comfortable and safe, and then be there sort of only for the time that is necessary, if it's necessary, then not having that exposure is ideal compared to being in it for an extended period of time if we have that option. Do you say anything
Yeah.
else about that, Cindy? I feel a little like I've tried to sort of frame it a little bit because I feel like, yes, it's something that I thought about, and I just am really aware of the potential to get I can't say too stuck, but like stuck on things that can feel more, we can't, I don't know how to articulate it,
Mm.
where I
I know
wouldn't
what you
want
mean.
it to be the factor that has someone choose one circumstance over the other when the resources and the support that's available in the hospital setting is truly beneficial.
Exactly. When it comes to having a baby that is healthy
Yeah, yeah,
and alive
yeah,
versus thinking about the microflora, it's like non-comparable. But it was a factor that when you talked about it, I was like, oh, that's so interesting because there's also like there's more bugs, but there are also bugs that are potentially more resistant because of the high level of sanitation that happens in a hospital setting. And so, and like anyone who works in a hospital has to get immunity to methicillin resistant Staph aureus, right? And so there's just knowing that there's potential for highly pathogenic bacteria. And again, there's also the potential at home that if you are group B strep positive,
yeah.
that your midwives will administer antibiotics to you, same thing in a hospital. And so these are just things to think about. And it's not about like a home birth versus a hospital birth versus
No.
like all of these things. It's more like how are we setting up the health of our kids like from the get-go and thinking about all of these things, but ultimately in a birth experience, what like the mission of this podcast is really for mothers to go into that experience with a little less fear and less uncertainty and less anxiety and feeling that there is spaciousness for confidence,
Mm,
for feeling like I want to say competent as well. I
mm,
know how to do this. I trust my body. I know that when I tune into myself that, these a lot of times these instincts kick in that like there's no prep really for that. The prep is really like how can you train yourself to go inward and connect to
mm,
your baby and connect to your body. And that's I think where a lot of the that feeling, that sensation of feeling empowered comes from and feeling supported. So when you brought in that doula,
yeah.
that allowed you to have more of an empowered experience versus a potentially extremely traumatic experience.
Mm,
The way that you describe it, that word might be a little much for you, but I think, most women would agree that that could be a potentially traumatic experience. So it is more about like, how can we bring in the information that's helpful for us to make certain decisions on our journey that are right for us, but
Mhm.
always tuning back inwards. It's not about what Dr. Cindy or Dr. Destiny
Mhm.
think. It's more about like what really feels right for me. And these are some, tidbits of information that helped me come to that
Mhm.
decision.
I want to loop back to one of the things that you said there. And before we hit record, Cindy and I kind of jammed on this topic exactly in a little bit different context. But you said it's really about how can we set ourselves up and our baby up from the get-go for optimal health and well-being, something along those lines. And this, like what I'm going to share, really applies to any context of your life. It's not just about pregnancy, birth, and motherhood, but I think if there's something, there's so many. Cindy said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm good." And there's so many things that like pull you in all these different directions. So, how do you navigate that, right, in your life? And when it comes to, pregnancy and birth and breastfeeding, what to feed your baby, like those topics, there's so many pieces of information and pieces of advice that can pull you in so many different directions. How do you navigate that? And I'll often say, it's really, how do we know our truth? How do we communicate our truth? How do we stand in our truth? And the first step of that is really the most important, because you can't do the rest of them unless you do the first one. How do you know your truth, right? And that's, I think, why I trip up a bit around the like the bugs in the flora conversation, because I think, how can you take care of your, how do I want to say this? How can you know yourself? I don't know what it was about. I knew that I wanted to have a doula with me. That was one clear piece of knowing for myself. Can I tell you how to know that? No, I think, when we can look back on past experiences and like what has worked for me, what has not worked for me. When I envision this circumstance with all the information that I've gathered, how does it land in my body? Do I know what that feels like? Can I reference an experience where someone has, let's just use a simple one like, "Hey, Cindy, want to go out for dinner for, let's use oysters," because people are polarized if they like them or not. And if you're like, "Yes, I really want to go for oysters," that's body feedback. If you're answering from your truth versus like, "Oh my God, I really want to go for dinner with you, but not oysters." So whatever that experience is to you, where you can tap into like your hell yes and your hell no, like referencing that feeling and bringing just a little bit of validity to that feeling that you feel when you're considering what your options are, or how you feel most contained. I think more than how you navigate in your pregnancy, birth, and motherhood experience, it's really about, do you feel like you know what you desire and that you can speak and feel heard? You may, in the context of birth, know what you desire, speak and be heard, and not have the option of what it is that you desire in that context, and maybe for very good reason, right? And so then I think that's where it's like all of manifestation, where you get clear on your desire, you set your intention so that you have something that you're moving towards, working towards, anchored towards. But in all of manifestation, it's like the more you hold on to it, the less you have it. It's not about the goal, but who you are, who you become in the pursuit of the goal. And I think those pieces are really true to birth, because there is a lot of variables that play into how it all goes. And there's a big element of setting that intention, knowing yourself, doing your best to set yourself up for what it is that you desire, and releasing how that all plays out, because it may be totally different than what you intended, and that's not a failure on your part, or probably anyone else's part. There's We see it in our, in health, when you're seeing clients as a naturopathic doctor. Sometimes um, someone will have a health concern and they'll say, "I'm doing all the right things. Why is this happening?" And it's because not all the things are in our control. I think in a Western society, sometimes we overinflate the amount of control that we have because we have a decent amount of control, but we have a lot of influence, right? And we have an impact. What we don't have is control, right? And so then when we move into our experience, we work towards what we desire, and then the rest is release and recognizing that it's not failure, but just that not all the variables can we manipulate, right?
Hmm. Yeah, birth is, I think, like a master class in surrender and letting go
Can we just
of
say everything to
control.
do with like pregnancy, motherhood, and birth
Yes,
is?
yes, not just birth.
Yeah.
I always see that as like setting you up for like the skill set of that in
Mm.
motherhood. Like the
I
more you
think
can
it's
like surrender and let go, the less friction there is on your motherhood journey.
it's not about letting go of what you desire when you say that. I remember pulling a rock out of a pile at a yoga studio one time. It said surrender, and I felt like I was going to vomit in the back of my mouth. It's like the grossest word. I don't like it. But, from the, I always say motherhood or parenthood begins when we hold the desire for that child in our heart. How we actually get pregnant, the timing of when we get pregnant, how the pregnancy goes, when the baby is born, how the baby is born, who that human is as they show up, after they show up in your space. There is just so much that's not in our control. In our influence, yes. In our control, no.
Absolutely. And speaking to that, I remember when I was preparing for my birth experiences, like I very much intuitively felt that like
Mm.
here's what I desire, here's what I'm preparing for. I'm going to have the shelves of, things that I need and supplies, but I am also making the intention that if I need to transfer or if this ends in a C-section, then fine,
Yeah,
cool. When it didn't, I didn't make it mean anything.
yeah.
And I think that took so much pressure off of how things played out. Because had I felt like that was wrong or bad in any way, I think it would have, things might have shifted a little bit in how I experienced the birth of my children.
As part of the hypnobirthing curriculum, there was 3 questions that they taught. And those 3 questions, I think, come with a lot of wisdom. And they positioned it, or at least the instructor that I had at the time, positioned it as, when there is a recommendation or an intervention that is being suggested for you, there's 3 questions you can ask now. I'm going to see if I can remember them clearly. The first one is to ask, is this an emergency? Because that's going to anchor a lot of how you might want to respond in that. So, is this an emergency? Yes or no? Are there any other options? It's the second one. And I can't remember how they worded the third one, but it's something along the lines of like, can I have X amount of time before I answer this question? And the answer to that might be no, like you have seconds. But that's why you ask that first one, and that's why you ask that second one, right? So, is this an emergency? Are there any other options? And how much time before we need a concrete answer? And those questions to me just come back to like those 3 pieces of information are what will either allow you to make an empowered alternate decision or surrender to the fact that this is the best decision for you and your baby right now. And I think that's kind of that biggest piece, is to be able to feel empowered in your circumstance rather than subject to it, or that your surrender is because you know that's what is best for you in that moment.
Yeah.
Empowered might be empowered to surrender.
Hmm. I know that sometimes I'm like, oh, this word can be a little bit tricky. Surrender. And I'm like, we're not saying you just like are
Passive.
surrendering to what, yeah, passive to
Yeah.
like what everyone around you is telling you to do, even if it doesn't feel good for you.
Yeah.
The word surrender is very much like letting go of the fact that you want to control everything, letting go of the fact that you want things to go a specific way. and only that way. It
Yeah.
is surrendering to the
Being held.
sensations, and yeah, and allowing yourself to be cared for in a little bit of a different way. It's a tricky word, but it's definitely doesn't mean be passive or complacent in any way. It is coming from an empowered place.
Very much so. And I think my reaction in the yoga studio when I pulled the rock that had the word surrender was based off a misconception of what I felt that word to be. And I now see it much more as like I allowing myself to receive. I am allowing myself to be supported. I'm allowing myself to be held. I am stepping into trust. And that's more of trust of self and trust of other. And that's more of the feeling that I have around it now. And what a gift, truly. There's so many times where, we have to show up and lead in our life. And in my experience of birth, I didn't want to be in my brain at all in birth. Not this one, not my forebrain. I'm pointing to my forehead, not my forebrain, because I think on some level, I felt for myself that my forebrain was going to get in my way, kind of looping back to what the line that I shared with Cindy. How can I get out of my own way when it comes to birth? And I may have shared that after I delivered. I don't remember because I remember in my birth experience, what stood out to me so much is like my body knows what it's doing. It's going to do its very best to do what it's doing. Can it go sideways? Absolutely, but it's going to try its best to do exactly what it needs to do. And if I try to control that too much, I'm going to interrupt the circuit, is how it felt to me, right? If it's telling me like you've got to growl like a grizzly bear, then I'm going to growl like a grizzly bear and I'm not going to try and stop that. And if it's telling me, it just felt like in that birth experience that my body was leading me and that if I was going to attempt to do something different than what it was guiding me to do, that I think that's just the line. I was gonna interrupt the circuit. And
I love that
absolutely
so
there's
much.
yeah, and absolutely there's times where like you do need to interrupt the circuit to manage a circumstance. But there's many times that, and I like hearing these stories from my husband and his experience in labor and delivery. There's many times where really, how do I say this in a way that's like I think he's seen enough people before birth and after birth that ability to not try to over control. I think he worries more when he sees someone who's trying to over control the circumstance on how the birth trajectory may go and how they may experience that trajectory. There's just
Mhm.
more of a question mark, I think, and I'm speaking for him, so that's not fair. But what I see in his experience is that there's more of a question mark of how that may go versus in those that don't have that sort of tight grip on what it needs to look like and how it needs to go. So circling back to that surrender,
Yeah.
empowered surrender, that's going to be the line
I like
today.
that better. Yeah, empowered surrender.
Yeah.
And that's just like the beginning, because as you welcome this little tiny human into your life, and if there's siblings involved as well, it is just again a masterclass in surrender and letting go of control, and learning to like ride the waves. Like you can't control the ocean, you can't control the waves, but you can learn how to navigate them. You can get a surfboard, you can get a sailboat, you can like use those sails to your advantage, and you can direct things in a certain way with like the sense of like working with the ocean instead of trying to control it, and like, nope, don't make that wave right here, don't make that wave over there, nope, nope, that's wrong. It is
Yeah.
just a master class in that co-creation, that cooperation with what's going on around you.
Like that analogy. I feel like nature is our greatest teacher and we are nature. So I feel like there's so many lessons that can be learned just by observing that. And I think the ocean is a really powerful one, as the seasons, as the weather, as the wind, as all of that. I think it would feel weird to me to not speak to the motherhood piece,
I
the,
agree.
the eye, right? And I think that's kind of where what you're leaning into a little bit too. And I don't have any answers. I think there was in a group text the other day with some of the people that we were in school with, somebody asked a question about this parent is bringing in their child, they're struggling with these behaviors, like what types of things would you consider? And in the context of this group, I have the most kids and the oldest kids. And I said, I've got nothing. They all had some lovely, tips and tricks, but I feel like that's just kind of and I didn't have nothing, but it was kind of that's how I don't the answers are not prescript, right? Like how to navigate is not prescript. And so I kind of like Cindy, I have a lot of respect for how you navigate the waves of life. And I actually want to kick it back to you, like flip this for a quick second here and ask you, like, what, when you look at parenthood and like navigating what you want or wanted or think where things haven't been what you've expected, and you're doing your best, but there's challenges and there's beauty and there's all of the above. What keeps you sort of centered with perspective and intention in the storms?
Yeah, I think I always come back to that statement that this is happening for me on some level
Mm,
instead of to me. There I go into this is happening to me and I go into my like victimy consciousness and I relish in that space for a little while. But ultimately I give myself the time to go there and then I ultimately come back to this is happening for me.
yeah.
And from that place, beauty and magic just emerge. I
Mm,
allow some spaciousness. It's that surrender. And that's why I always feel like the birth experience has power to really like initiate us into the power of how to navigate life. How do we
yeah.
navigate motherhood? How do we navigate raising these tiny humans? What a privilege it is to do this, but how do we
Yeah.
do it from a place of feeling like it is a privilege rather than feeling like a murder or feeling like this is a burden or I'm not getting support, right?
Yeah.
And so the big surrender happened for me when I realized I can't control anything. It's all out of my control. But somehow this is happening for me. And coming back to community, like I feel like on this podcast, almost every podcast we mention community
Mm,
because it is what we've kind of been severed from
yeah.
and what is so crucial to our journey and our healing and our legacy. Like our bond, me and you, like our children have benefited from this. It is a part of our legacy, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and it's amazing what happens when we call in that community and when we are having moments of struggle, that community really shows up and it is such a beautiful heart-warming, heart-filling thing to experience.
Mm,
And you also realize when you have those moments of struggle that it's like, okay, I can play with this.
right.
I can play with this. It's like those moments where it's like, if not me, who? If not now, when?
Yeah.
All of those things that you've put on the back burner. I'll do this when, or I'm not good enough. I need to get another certification. Then I can try this. I'm not smart enough. I don't have enough experience. Who's going to listen to me? I've even had moments where I think it's in someone's name, like, oh, they have like a very simple name. That's why they're successful. They have a very exotic name. That's why they're very successful. And then you realize, like, why not? Let's
Yeah.
give it a shot. And a lot of magic can happen in those spaces and you begin to attract people who are on the same similar journey or can support you on your journey. I'm of the big belief that when you're doing what you feel is aligned for you, that's in the best good for your kids as well. I've had to shed that martyrdom that so many mothers have, where like we have to self sacrifice so that our kids can be well and healthy and be successful in this world. When really what's happening is I'm actually imprinting onto them that you're not a victim of your circumstances. You can actually learn how to be more powerful from those circumstances that happen. And it's not easy.
No.
I fall off of my surfboard a lot.
Yeah.
I need help. I need like a
Yeah.
beautiful surf instructor to help me sometimes. But you get on and you learn to ride those waves, and oh my gosh, it is exhilarating and it is so much fun. And I know we were talking about the analogy of surfing, but like on my bucket list is
Yeah.
being able to surf where the wave is like you're in a tunnel of the
Ooh,
wave.
you.
I got to do that before I die.
I'm
Um,
unsurprised that this is on your bucket list.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just I think that's how I'm navigating things. It's with that anchor of
Yeah.
like this is happening for me, and that when you said at the beginning that it's happening through you,
Mm,
and you kind of had an impact on me, you planted like the seed in my head from just your journey. I feel like it's also happening through me
right.
somehow, and I can
Yeah.
hopefully have some kind of positive impact or
Yeah.
inspire someone along the way.
There's so much gold in what you said. And I think one of the things with you, Cindy, is you have this like grace to you that I think without knowing part of your journey, like knowing part of your journey, I feel the poignancy in what you shared. And yet you have this grace, this like light and this love and light way of sharing those like tidbits that you've learned that are so powerful in understanding the depth of not easy that some of those experiences have been, right? And I want to circle back to a couple things that you said. For me, not to me. There's being a victim and villain is a really real thing, and I don't want to dismiss that. And if we get too stuck in being subject to our circumstances or what has happened, what we lose sight of is our influence or how to move forward sometimes is the risk that can occur. And that comes back to then knowing what we want and how we ask for it and what we do after we've asked for it, how much we're gripping it versus communicating, standing for, and then allowing ourselves to receive and flow, if you will.
I have to say, after I had my first daughter, I messaged our group again for some advice with my second daughter preparation. And I was like, I know there's so much information out there. I've like forgotten a lot because it's been a few years. But I don't want to overwhelm myself. I'm like over resourced. I often feel over
Right.
resourced. There's too many books to read. There's too many people that I need to ask help for, like
Yeah.
ask help from, and like over resourced. And so I think the simpler, the better. And you gave a beautiful piece of advice, and it was postpartum doula. That's
Mm.
it. You're so good at giving like the
A nugget.
simple, effective advice. The first one was the more you can get out of your own way, the better. And then the second was postpartum doula. So that really got my gears focused on postpartum. After my first, like, yes, you realize how important the postpartum period is and the support that you have in that period is. And so for my second, I was like, okay, here's how I'm going to prepare for the postpartum period. I even started like getting the gears turning about how like to support my relationship because that
Right.
really took me off guard.
Right.
I prepared for the birth with my first. Made sure I had the support system in place, but I was not prepared for the impact it would have on my relationship.
Right.
And so for the second time around, I put a little bit more emphasis on that. And so yeah, I think it's important for listeners to hear that too when it comes to community. It's like not just for the pregnancy, not just for the birth part. It is, oh my goodness, it is the whole motherhood journey, the postpartum period especially.
Absolutely. And I do remember what I was going to say, and it actually relates to community. You spoke to a little bit of the struggle, like some of the things that have been hard, or like when you have to, when you go into that place of sort of relishing in the it's happening to me bit, and then, you feel it, experience it, and then go back into, okay, so if it's happening for me, how am I responding to it? I think in our day and age where we see a lot of polished right? Sometimes it's easy to forget the that we're not alone in the struggle and that the struggle is really real. And while it's not the same for everybody, the more connected we can be to community and having those safe spaces to be heard and to witness each other, the more we realize that it's the shiny parts, it can only really be as shiny as it's been tricky sometimes, right? Like I think there can be that can be proportional to each other. The After I had my first one, my first child, and people would ask me like, "How is motherhood?" I remember my token answer would be, the reward is equal to the challenge, and it's really, really rewarding. And then I would just leave it at that, and I'd smile with my tired eyes. But I think that is one of the greatest gifts of community. And when I first was born, it was like at the onset of when Facebook communities were happening, and there was a couple people that didn't live close to me, but who had started this Facebook community of moms who had kids within like 6 months of each other, and that was such an anchor point for me because it was in the day where the community was nothing fancy. It was just like, oh, my kid's no longer sleeping and they were sleeping. Is that happening over there? And the best thing that I could hear is like, yep, happening here. And be like, yeah, happening here too. That was like the best part of the community and the circumstance. But and then just I wanted to highlight that bit of like not gaslighting yourself for your feelings, having your feelings, allowing yourself to go there, being in that experience. It's very normal, it's very human, and it's very part of the process. And then making a decision on how you are going to navigate from there and falling off your surfboard and getting back on and falling off and getting back on. We see it in all of the quotes of it's not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get back up. It's not easy sometimes, right? And those who have not been in a place of, I'll just keep it to parenthood, sometimes they'll ask, like, how do you do it? I don't even understand how you do it. You don't, you do it because you don't have another option and you don't suffer the fact you have to do it. You just do it. And now I want to contextualize that in the frame of the thing that I have come to understand is the thing that I must do to give the most to my family is first give the most to myself. And I know it's cliche, super cliche, but they're not here to take care of me. That's not why they're not even my partner. Like it's not their job to take care of me. Nobody can know me to the same and know what makes the biggest difference for me to the same depth as I can learn that for myself. And it's going to not be linear. It's going to change over time. But the only way that I can be the most loving, generous, patient mom to my kids is if I can first do my very darndest, and it's the hardest to do for myself. And the way that I can have my partner feel the best in the context of us is if I know what really matters to me and what really doesn't, and not how, I was going to say, and how to access that, but to work towards figuring out how to access that. Because I might ask him for something thinking that it's going to be the thing that helps me to feel better, and it might make me feel worse. And that's not his fault. It's just, that wasn't it. We're going to try again. Yeah. A good friend of mine once said to me in a moment where I was having trouble receiving, she didn't know I was having trouble receiving from those around me. She just was sharing about her own experience of life. And she said she was expressing to me how much she appreciates being able to walk beside people in their journey and what a privilege that is to her to be able to like hear and witness and walk beside and support where she can support. And she didn't know that I was struggling at that time to accept any, not, I shouldn't say any, accept the level of generosity I was feeling from her. I shared that with her after, and it was just a real enlightening moment for me to recognize like my job is to be in my business, to not be in other people's business. And what that means to me is to know my thoughts and feelings, priorities and intentions, not to project what others' thoughts, feelings, emotions are, to respect them enough to allow them to be in their business and not try to manipulate it and not try to figure out and determine what their stories are. I'll often say to somebody when they want to give me something and I'm getting in my head about what they might be thinking, I'll say, that's very generous of you. I'm going to trust you to tell me if it's no longer feeling good to you. And it's kind of how I put it out there. And so I wanted to highlight that in the context of postpartum. Often people really want to help. They just don't know what is going to make the biggest difference to you. And it is a gift to share what would make the biggest difference to you without the expectation that they're going to fill that and exceed that, but simply to share, like, this is the thing that I am seeking support on. If that feels good to you, awesome. If it doesn't, and you know someone else, cool. If you don't know someone else, cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not entitled, it's not rude. It can be really kind to just say that. And then again, with empowered surrender, release if that's through them or not through them,
Mm.
partner included.
I love that little caveat at the end. A lot of surrender and a lot of release in that context as well. But that is so powerful to say because before children, a lot of us have trouble asking for help. And then we are gifted a situation where often it's like a sink or swim situation. If you don't ask for help,
Yeah.
there's one way you're going to go. And as much as we want to be independent and self-reliant in this society and how it's so like hyped up and revered for people to say like I did it all on my own, we actually really don't do anything fully on our own. And the more that we can ask for help, it's so interesting what happens is like your house becomes more full, your heart becomes more full, your children's lives become more full. The more you're able to ask for help from that place that you're describing, it's not, I expect this from this person. I'm just letting people know who want to help what my actual needs are and what's going to make the biggest difference for me. And
Mhm.
if they're able to provide that, amazing. But at least you're pulling on that string. I heard you say on a podcast one time, this like spider web of community of support. I'm not sure how you
Mm.
worded it, but I loved that visual because it's like you can just tug on a string when you're in those like sink or swim situations and much beforehand so you don't get to those sink or
Mm.
swim moments, right? And just
Mhm.
tug on that string a little bit. Hello, how are you over there? Community member, I may need you in a little bit. I'm feeling this
Yeah.
certain way, or I just want to connect. I just need some you know time with another woman to feel that like mother to mother support or whatever
Mm.
it might be.
Yeah, I think if we use sort of a manifestation language, it's like we're sharing what we're calling in. We're not saying where, we don't know where necessarily it's going to come from. It might be from that person we're sharing with, it might be through that person, it might be in a totally different facet. But when we share with the people around us that want to hear what we're calling in, that might feel like language that allows that communication more than directly saying, and it's totally fine to directly ask for help. Hey, you, can you do this? But when we're really struggling to do that, sometimes I think thinking of like sharing what you're calling in and without the expectation of where it's coming from can also open up that kind of communication of first just actually thinking about what it is that you want to call in and then how you want to communicate it.
Yeah, so important. And when it comes to the birth situation, you can call in the team, the support system that you want around you. You can call in, a certain type of person that you feel would be very supportive for you. And so I think this podcast, I think I had a certain way that I thought it was going to go, but what it's become is how to like navigate this whole process. And it comes down to like that hell yes and that hell no that you were talking about, asking those very important questions like, is this an emergency? Are there any alternatives? And how much can I have some time to think about this? And you can use that to a less intense degree throughout your whole motherhood journey.
Mm, hmm.
and calling in the community and learning how to ask for help and surrendering to what's going on around you and understanding that on some level, this is always happening for you, for your highest good and evolution and growth instead of to you. And it's okay to feel that sense of like, oh my God, what is actually happening right
Yeah.
now?
Yeah.
And be
This
there
is dumb.
and be there and let those emotions flow through you and allow yourself to have like a tantrum and cry and lean on your support system, but ultimately coming back to that center where you do have the power to navigate this in a
Mm-hmm.
certain way. And that's what we imprint on our kids. So for my last question,
Mm.
Destiny, before we head off, I like to ask all my guests from the context of the imprint of birth. I call it the profound imprint because I feel like it lasts a lifetime in the sense that our kids, they enter this reality and it's either an imprint of love and safety and trust, and
Mm.
these are all signatures of oxytocin, and they move through the world from that place, or they can be imprinted with fear and uncertainty and mistrust and survival mode. And they can move through the world from that place. And it's not permanent. We can do things to repair. But a part of the mission with this podcast is to have that happen so that we can impact the next generation. And if everyone ideally is walking through the world with an imprint of love and safety and trust,
Mm.
I think we'd be looking at a very different world.
Mm.
So, with that being said, what would you like to imprint onto the ears of the listeners? It's a lot of new moms, it's a lot of couples, families preparing for the birth of their kids. It's also a lot of people who want to birth something beautiful and creative into this world. What would you like to imprint onto their ears?
Oh, that's a big one. Sit with it for a moment. I think two things. I think in this day and age, we are pulled away from ourselves so much. The way that we can show up as our best selves for ourselves and our community and around us is when we work to create the space to anchor back into self and back into truth, back into desire, and back into that nurture of self, knowing that that self nurture, that self parenting, which sometimes doesn't feel fuzzy, and that self knowing or journey towards it is really the key to the greatest capacity to create what you desire. That's the first bit. And then I think the second piece is we're going to get it wrong like 100 times before we get it right. And so while it can sound all idealistic to, just take care of you so that you can be your radiant self, like that is not a straight path down the beach, right? That is like, whoops, effed it up. Sorry. I'm gonna try again. Like, oh, that really hurt me. Oh, that really hurt you. I think we got it this time. That's a little bit more how that goes. And that is perfect. It's perfect, just in its messy reality of the way that it goes. I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to everybody else. And I'm going to kind of say it to myself as I share it with you all, is just simply that desire, that thing, that beautiful thing that's pulling you and that you can't shake. It's like Cindy said, like, if not me, who? If not now, when? And maybe the when is later, maybe the when is now, and maybe the who is you, and maybe the who is not you. But it's the asking of the question, how I can't let the desire for it to show up this way, this time, right now, stop me from moving towards that thing that's pulling me. And so, kind of pulling it back, caring for self as a parent would care for a loving parent, would care for a child, parenting self with self love and accountability, and being gracious with the fact that, trust yourself. If you don't get it right, you can try again, and you're going to keep moving towards that in the way that is exactly as it needs to be, because it's happening for you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think this is like the blueprint, like the how do you really even know what you desire and how do you navigate the journey. I'm so grateful that we were able to create this and send it out there into the field, and hopefully it can have a positive impact on anyone who is called to listen. Des, if people, sorry, go ahead.
Cindy, I was going to sort of circle back to what I said at the beginning, and maybe you listened to our whole conversation today and you're like, that is what I don't want. And that is, and maybe you listened and you've gotten a tidbit of something that you do want, and that also is perfect. So,
Yes, absolutely. Des, what's alive for you right now? If people want to connect with you, if they want to work with you, how can they do that?
oh gosh. Life is evolving. We're coming back to the original, like, where is my energy going conversation? Because the work is always, right? Is what am I calling in? In this moment, the facet of my work is in the context of naturopathic medicine, providing IV therapy. I'm located in Ontario at two different clinics, True Roots Healthcare in Uxbridge and Durham Natural Healthcare in Ajax. I love being in the context of providing a therapeutic where people can receive, because so much of what we do as naturopathic doctors takes a lot of effort, and that's beautiful, but I love pairing it with things that we can receive. So those are the two places that I am showing up the most. And I love operating in the context of mentorship. And if that's of interest to you, you can reach out. I think Cindy has the contact information for me in the show notes, if that is something that you're interested in as well.
Yes. And like I said at the beginning of the podcast, Destiny is one of the most competent human beings I have ever come across in my whole life. So reach out to her if you need support. And IV therapy, oh my gosh, if you have a migraine and you go in, you leave often without a migraine. So that is amazing, among
Nausea,
many
pregnancy,
other. Yes,
funneling,
nausea. Oh my
menstrual
gosh.
cramps, recovering from postpartum,
Yes.
etc.
Yes. Oh, so many things. Yeah. So reach out to Destiny if you're in either Ajax or Uxbridge area, surrounding area. And she is an amazing human, an amazing light in this world. Thank you so much for doing this again.
Indeed.
And I cannot wait till we get together again.
Likewise.
Bye, Des.
Bye.